it's a real pleasure and honor to be here. This is my first time in New York, but I've been watching from afar for a long time, and it's been sort of wonderful to see the center grow and see all the great events that are going on here. This has really become sort of a go-to place for issues of global security. So it's a fantastic honor to be here, and thanks so much, especially to the staff for helping out, for everybody being so hospitable. I'm not the only visitor to a faraway place this week. Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, is doing a state visit. And in fact, a couple of hours from now, there's going to be a state dinner at the White House. President Obama hosting Xi Jinping. And while his visit has been somewhat overshadowed by the Pope's visit this week, it is perhaps equally, if not more important to issues of American global security, what's going on. A lot of things have gone on. There has been good news that's come out of this visit. Just this afternoon, the White House released a fact sheet of all the good things that were accomplished during the Chinese leader's visit. Things ranging from new agreements on nuclear security to new language about climate change. And China announced that it's going to do new legislation for a cap-and-trade system to try to get its carbon emissions under control. All great news. These are intrinsically good things. However, there's also tension. In the news this week, U.S. officials expressed very loud concerns about Chinese efforts in cyberspace, with a specific reference to cyber espionage. Susan Rice came out very boldly and said, this is not a minor issue for the United States, this is a major issue. This is something that's really holding U.S.-China relations back. So there was clearly some tension even during the meeting. And I think this tension speaks to a deeper and more troubling element of U.S.-China relations. Despite the good news this week, despite efforts to improve diplomatic relations, there are deep, fundamental disagreements between these two great powers. And there's deep friction. I would also argue that there's an ongoing strategic competition in East Asia. We are past the point of wondering whether or not a competition will occur. I think it's ongoing now. China is doing things to try to improve its position and maybe start to change the nature of the regional political order. The United States doesn't want that to happen. Now, just because there's a strategic competition, great powers are always jostling, it doesn't mean that there's going to be conflict. And even if there's conflict, that doesn't mean there's going to be war. So I don't want to sound like I'm needlessly pessimistic here. However, these things are possible, even if they are unknown. A military contest between these two countries is possible. There are scenarios which would make it happen. And the history of great power relations suggests that this could be something that we'll have to deal with, even if it's unlikely. This particular great power competition is also important because these are two nuclear-armed powers, both with very capable conventional forces, but also with nuclear capabilities. China's nuclear capabilities have been getting much better. The doctrine has become much more sophisticated. Capabilities much more impressive over the last 20 years. So if a conflict, and even a violent conflict, were to break out, we have to think about how nuclear forces and conventional forces would interact. Is there a possibility for escalation? Would one or both countries act recklessly with their nuclear forces in the event of conflict? Or would the presence of nuclear weapons dampen the incentives for escalation? Would it give each side a reason to be sober and lead to more muted conflict? Those are the questions that are driving this research, and this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to basically divide my comments into three sections. I'm going to talk about what both sides want. If there was a conflict, what would they be fighting for? What are the political stakes? What are we talking about? Very often when people do military balances, they leave the politics out of it. I think this is a mistake. Referring to military capabilities on each side without thinking about the stakes and causes of the conflict misses a big part of the story. Now, they might not get what they want in a conflict. In fact, both sides might get something far worse. So in the second section, I'm going to discuss two bad scenarios. Two things that might happen which go in ways that neither side wants or expects. And in the third section, I'm going to try to resolve these problems. Now, I have to give you a warning up front. These aren't satisfactory answers. I don't have the riddle to solve this puzzle, but I'll at least try to give some useful advice, or maybe at least encourage people to think about what questions that strategists and leaders should be asking of themselves as this progresses. Okay, we'll start with China. If there was a conflict, what would they be fighting over? Well, most analysts of U.S.-China relations think that the biggest hotspot remains Taiwan, the place of Taiwan in China. Now, Taiwan, as you know, split from China as a result of the Civil War in 1949. The nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, fled to Taiwan, sitting on the beach, staring across the water at the mainland, and taking over in October 1949 and establishing a communist government was Mao Zedong, sitting on the opposite beach, staring across the waves. The conflict was never fully resolved. Both sides harbored dreams of ending it once and for all in a long, long time. Now, since the early 70s, they've reached a modus operandi. They've reached a way of fudging this fundamental political problem, which is acceptable to both. And yet there are scenarios in which we could see this conflict becoming quite hostile again. Principally, if Taiwanese politics change and if Taiwanese leaders decide that they want to declare formal independence once and for all. In that scenario, Chinese leaders would feel compelled or may feel intense pressure to do something about that, to attack Taiwan, to not let Taiwan break free formally once and for all. Taiwan is wrapped up in issues of Chinese nationalism. This is a very powerful issue for both the Chinese leadership and for the Chinese people. The notion that Taiwan ultimately is part of China and that it can't break away. One also suspects that if Taiwan tried to break away, the Chinese leadership would feel that its own future is at stake. The CCP would feel that if it didn't do something to stop Taiwan from declaring independence, it might lose control. So whenever there's an issue in which intense nationalism and concerns over the survival of the regime are at stake, you can expect that the Chinese regime will be very willing to take risks, even if those risks included fighting Taiwan's protector, the United States. That's one potential flashpoint. A second one, disputes with Japan over contested islands and rocks. This is a picture of some of what the Chinese call it Diaoyu Islands, and the Japanese call it Senkaku Islands. There are 5 islands and 3 rocky formations which are underwater half of the year. And these lie in the East China Sea. And of late, both sides have been intensifying their competition for ownership of these rocky outcroppings. To a lot of Western observers, we were puzzled by this. Why are they coming into conflict? Why are they having this intense dispute over a bunch of rocks in the ocean? There's no intrinsic strategic value to these, even though the Japanese have set up basically a small police garrison. There's no intrinsic they're not that strategically important. Why do these matter? Well, again, it's an issue of nationalism which is wrapped up in them. Chinese nationalists, Japanese nationalists think that this is quite important for them to establish control, that they own them, that they're rightfully theirs. And in the last few years, you've seen encounters between vessels on both sides coming close to each other, which has caused some observers to worry that there could be a war by accident. Right, that there could be a miscalculation, that violence could spiral out of some conflict that wasn't intended. So conflict between China and Japan, again, wrapping the United States in, is a cause of concern. Similarly, in the South China Sea, there are island disputes between China and some of its neighbors in the south over contested islands. China has been very active. Since 1947, China has claimed ownership over large swaths of the South China Sea, something it calls the 9-dashed line. This is a very old maritime claim, but of late, China has intensified its efforts to make good on those claims. And again, the United States is unhappy about this. The United States is saying we don't find those claims legally valid, justified. We think what you're doing is creating new risk. We would like to stop it. China simply is not stopping it. So this is a third area in which political competition could spiral into some sort of military conflict. What do all these things have in common? What do all these things have in common? They all suggest China's desire to alter the regional status quo in some way, either by changing the status of Taiwan or by forcing others in the region and the United States to accept that China has a much stronger maritime position than it has in the past. That it is not just a mainland power, that it is not just a land power, but that it actually is a leading maritime power in East Asia. That would represent a pretty important shift in the regional status quo. How would China seek to fight? How would they go about getting these political objects? Well, China over the last 20 years has done some pretty remarkable things with its military. It has invested heavily in modernization across all of its services, its Navy, Air Force. It's increased its nuclear capabilities. It's trying to professionalize the People's Liberation Army. It's doing all sorts of investment in becoming a modern military. American observers are worried that part of this means buying the kind of capabilities that could keep the United States out of the theater. This is what Americans call the anti-access problem. More advanced Chinese ballistic missiles, warships, mines, aircraft, things that would make it harder for the U.S. Navy to operate a theater, and if it got there, would make it more costly. China has been investing heavily in these kinds of capabilities. An emphasis in Chinese military publications has been the importance of retaining the initiative, acting very quickly, seizing the initiative in any conflict, and controlling communications. Chinese writers talk about informatized or informationized combat. It's sort of a mouthful, but it suggests that they think of communications as being vital to any military conflict. They want to control that part of the fight, information fight. So they're building lots of new hardware, they're professionalizing the force, they're improving their capabilities, and they're talking about fighting quickly and keeping wars local. Chinese military ratings, they constantly stress the importance of keeping wars localized. They don't want them to spread out of control. They want to win quickly. They want to keep things under control. Importantly, another aspect of Chinese doctrine has been the massive expansion of its ballistic missile program. China has about tripled its short-range ballistic missile stockpile since the early part of the last decade. It's also increased its medium-range ballistic missile capabilities. A few weeks ago, China had a big military parade to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, and it finally unveiled something that Americans had talked about for a long time, the DF-21D, the so-called carrier killer ballistic missile. A modernized ballistic missile which has guidance which would potentially let it target incoming carrier battleships. This is very worrisome to the United States for obvious reasons. The United States has enjoyed the fact that it's had basically free reign on sending its carriers wherever it wants. Well, a missile like this, a road mobile missile that could potentially target these carriers, is a real cause for concern. So again, China is trying to think about how to win quickly and how to make it hard for the United States to fight in theater and more costly if it does arrive. Finally, again, China talks a lot about information, how to win in an informatized mission. So much of warfare, we are told, rests on ones and zeros, that control of one's own communications and efforts to interrupt the other's communications are absolutely vital in war. This is a nice image, I just wrapped this off of Google, but it appears to me to be 2nd Artillery officers, judging by the patch, doing some sort of information exercise. This seems to be central to how they're thinking about a future. It'll be short, it'll be sharp, it'll be localized, and whoever dominates information has a much better chance than its rivals. And interestingly, this all should sound very familiar to students of American military doctrine. All of these ideas seem to come out of the U.S. wing. for at least the last 25 years, the United States has really emphasized speed, precision, and communications, both protecting one's own communications and interrupting the other side's communications. So China is moving in this direction. It seems to be how they're thinking about conventional war. What about China's nuclear capabilities? What are they up to in nuclear? Well, for a long time, China really didn't have a nuclear doctrine. China tested its first nuclear device in 1964, and under Mao, China had what was called a minimum deterrent. It didn't really have a sophisticated or formal doctrine. Essentially, Mao's idea was that you just need a handful of nuclear weapons, and nobody will mess with you, or the likelihood that they'll mess with you is much lower. It's a threat in being. You don't have to think hard about how to deploy these things, how to operationalize them, how to protect them. Even a tiny risk of retaliation would be enough to convince other countries not to get involved. Well, that has changed. Along with China's conventional military modernization and its efforts to make a more professional force, a more sophisticated conventional doctrine, it's updated its nuclear doctrine. It's moved from what was called minimum deterrence to what some scholars call assured retaliation. The idea that in order to guarantee a nuclear response, you have to think harder about how to protect your own capabilities. This includes things like putting them on road mobile launchers, or hiding them, or moving them around, or building a slightly larger number of weapons so that you can reliably fend off somebody else's efforts to destroy them in the first strike. The Chinese Second Artillery Force, which controls both its conventional and nuclear ballistic missiles, has also worked very hard on updating its doctrine and making, or at least trying to train in more realistic ways. Again, to make the force more professional. China, the purpose of its nuclear force, as far as I can tell, is still principally deterrence. Its official position is no first use. It will not use nuclear weapons unless attacked with nuclear weapons. Although there seems to be some wiggle room with that conception now. Some Chinese writings suggest that if a foreign enemy attacked China in ways that threatened its core strategic interests, even with conventional weapons, maybe it would consider a nuclear response. So there's a little bit more flexibility. China also talks about, or Chinese writers also talk about the idea of nuclear deterrence enabling conventional operations. That is, if you have this shield which protects your core national interest, you'll feel a little safer fighting in a local conventional war. So they're thinking about nuclear weapons has evolved. Probably not going to be used. They prefer not to use them if have to. They seem to me to want to have them as a shield in order to enable conventional forces. But the threat is there in extremis. About the United States. What are U.S. goals? Well, if China seeks to change the status quo, at least in these hypothetical scenarios I've laid out, the U.S. goal would be to maintain the status quo. The United States, I think, justifiably views events in Asia over the last several decades as a signal achievement in American foreign policy. The United States broadly likes the fact that that East Asia is a center of world trade now. There are just huge amounts of finance and commerce which go through there. This is good. This is good for everybody. This is good economically. It sustains the global economy. The United States wants to keep those ships moving. It doesn't want to see that interrupted, especially in the event of a long war. It likes the fact that liberal economic ideas have spread to the region and wants to retain that. Other U.S. goals to preserve the status quo in terms of the web of international institutions and regional political institutions that it's helped to construct. Here's a picture of then Secretary of State Connie Rice at the ASEAN Regional Forum. Again, this is U.S. officials view these things as a triumph, taking a region which was prone to war, prone to very unstable economies, very unstable politics, and making it a powerhouse. With the United States playing a central role in that whole process. The United States doesn't want to see this fall apart. It likes the status quo, the economic status quo, and the political order as currently construct. The U.S. likes this a great deal. Now, in the event of a conflict, how would the United States think about maintaining the political status quo while dealing with China's new capabilities? 20 years ago, this wasn't a problem. 20 years ago, the Chinese military was simply not that capable of force, and the United States could pretty much operate with impunity, except when you get very close to the Chinese coastline. But again, China spent 20 years building its military and would make life very costly and dangerous for U.S. forces in the region. So, for U.S. planners, how do you prepare for a war against this kind of rival? How do you regain access? How can you ensure that you are operating even in these contested waters? Well, the U.S. approach has developed slowly, but I would argue focuses on two big features. One is operating quickly, attacking the enemy's ability to communicate with itself, and buying time to mobilize forces later to consolidate your gains. It's a very short, sort of bumper sticker version of U.S. conventional doctrine. You start by trying to force the enemy into sclerosis. You attack his communications, you attack his intelligence capabilities. You make it hard for him to execute basic operations. You blind him. And then you buy yourself time to slowly steam those carrier battle groups into the region, and you finish the war on your own terms. Now, several years ago, this basic idea was encapsulated in what was called air-sea battle. Air-sea battle was it has recently changed its name, but this is what everybody calls it, so I'll stick with that name. Air-sea battle. And air-sea battle caused a lot of controversy when it came out for reasons I'll discuss. But this was the basic idea underlying air-sea battle. You start with a quick strike against your enemy's communications and intelligence. And that's the way that you buy yourself access. You make it possible to operate in otherwise hostile areas. You buy time to mobilize. You send in your bigger forces, and you can win. There were a lot of critics of this concept. There still are a lot of critics of this concept because it does remain important in American planning. Among the criticisms of this concept are that it sort of treats the enemy like a potted plant. It pretends that the adversary force won't react to these efforts, that it will sit idly by and open itself up to blinding attacks and won't be able to do anything in response. People that study strategy say, well, this isn't really how war works. War is interactive, both sides seek clever ways to undermine the other, and you're just sort of assuming and hoping that the enemy just sits there while you execute this lovely linear plan. Okay? It sounds, to critics, sort of like a video game. And in fact, it was a video game. Well, Air-Sea Battle, for those of you old enough to remember the Atari 2600, this is a screenshot from Air-Sea Battle, right? Back when Atari still had its soul. It's a great game. It was a video game. And so critics sort of lambasted it. The Pentagon came under a lot of flack for it. It had stood up at what was called the Air-Sea Battle Office, and it stood down that office, and they changed the name, and they tried to deflect it and diffuse a lot of the criticism of this. And yeah, the idea is still there. The basic doctrinal idea hasn't left. And there's a reason for that. It's not just that it makes sense. It's not just that it's like a seductive idea. It's not just that it sounds great in theory. There is a track record of the United States fighting, and fighting reasonably well with these two ideas. In fact, I would argue this basically defines the way the United States has fought its last half dozen conventional wars. It's starting in the early 90s in Iraq and going all the way up to the present. Start with attacks on enemy intelligence and communications and roll in later. This was done. You start with it with electronic warfare attacks on the F-111 when they still flew, they don't fly anymore, to jam radar and to otherwise try to inhibit the enemy's understanding of what's going on in information space. You buy time, you attack with them with kinetic weapons, F-117, Gulf War I, destroying targets. And you buy time then for the slower moving but really powerful stuff, like the tanks, as happened in 1991 2003, or in case of Maritime East Asia, carrier battle groups. You buy yourself time to bring in big guns. So while it's easy to sort of laugh off the air-sea battle concept as like a video game, it sort of does have a track record. Right? At least the basic ideas behind how we fight have been proven. The United States has been very successful in conventional terms. Obviously, consolidating a conventional victory was hard, as we've learned, to our great pain, Afghanistan and Iraq. But at least in the conventional phase of operations, this concept has a track record. What about the nuclear aspect of American doctrine? Would the United States think about using nuclear weapons in a war? One of the criticisms the U.S. doesn't have a no first use policy, but it almost does. Where China formally says we will only use them if we've been attacked with nuclear weapons first, the United States has something called negative security reassurances. As long as you are a member in good standing of the international order and you don't do something really, really terrible, we won't use nuclear weapons against you. That covers almost every country and almost every circumstance. But it does leave a little opening if the U.S. so decided. And while the U.S. clearly doesn't want to use nuclear weapons, it has invested a lot in making them more lethal, principally by making them much more accurate. So the United States has a smaller force in terms of total numbers, but it's increasingly lethal because the warheads are so accurate. So the United States is moving away from nuclear weapons, but there's still a little chance. Now, in written discussions of air-sea battle, at least public discussions, they sort of assume nuclear weapons out of the equation. They assume that any conflict with an adversary with significant anti-access capabilities would remain at the conventional level. This is part and parcel to it. If you win quickly, if you go in there, if you blind them, you buy yourself time, you're not going to have to worry about things. You're going to fight the war on your terms. The United States is going to be able to fight where it fights best. Stand-up conventional fight. This has been an important assumption in some planning documents. The question I want to ask is that a reasonable assumption? Especially in a hypothetical scenario versus China. Is it reasonable to expect that the war would remain at the conventional level? Or would U.S. efforts to implement its preferred doctrine raise the possibility of nuclear escalation? This is one of the bad outcomes that could happen. If the war doesn't go quite the way we want it to go, one bad outcome is escalation. How does escalation occur? I argue there's three basic pathways to escalation. First is psychological. In the midst of an intense conventional campaign, I assume the leaders will be terrified, that chaos will reign, that they may let their emotions overtake them, and that they will lash out. Not because they go into a conflict wanting to use nuclear weapons, but they might not understand how best to respond. And in conditions of incredible stress, and fear, and panic, they might simply lash out. They might simply escalate because it is the default position, especially if they think they're losing. A second pathway to escalation, the political pathway. If you fight a war in such a way that you put your enemy's regime at risk, that regime might have no compunction about gambling for its own resurrection. If you are fighting and you think your government's going to be toppled, you think your regime is going to fall, you think it's all going to end, then even if escalation is not likely to help, you might be very willing to take that chance. Because what else do you have to lose? What else do you have to lose? If your regime is at risk, you might take great risk yourself. Finally, there's what scholars call inadvertent escalation. And inadvertent escalation essentially works like this. One side attacks conventional targets on the other, but the victim of those strikes doesn't understand that this is only supposed to be conventional targets. The victim of those strikes thinks that their nuclear deterrent is at risk. Those strikes are going to take down their ability to retaliate with nuclear weapons. even if that's not the intent. And so they retaliate with nuclear weapons. Inadvertent escalation. Air-sea battle could open up all three pathways. Start with a psychological path. Remember the basic logic of air-sea battle. That first strike is supposed to blind the adversary. It's deliberately supposed to sow confusion. It's deliberately supposed to sever communications. It's deliberately supposed to put the adversary in a position of sclerosis. If I was the target of that kind of attack, I might freak out. I might freak out more than a little bit. I'm designed to be shocked. Well, the danger is that if you shock your adversary, he might respond by escalating. He might not respond by simply becoming catatonic. He might not respond simply by going into a shell, but he might lash out. Second pathway to escalation was political. Now, here's a picture of the Chinese leadership, a recent picture. I am not a China specialist, but I understand from my colleagues who are, that the CCP is always concerned about maintaining the survival of the regime, maintaining the survival of the one-party communist state. And if there was a contest over an issue that was laden with nationalism, like Taiwan, that party might feel compelled to take extreme measures in order to rescue its. So if the fight was over Taiwan, and if American doctrine and American plans made it look like China was on the verge of a humiliating defeat over an issue of vital national import, the CCP might be compelled to raise the stakes, escalate. Finally, there's the possibility that air-sea battle opens up the possibility of inadvertent escalation. This is a map of Chinese missile brigades. Some critics of air-sea battle, myself included, have worried that to fight this war, you would have to target the mainland for various reasons. If you want to go into those in Q&A, we can. But for various reasons, it would make sense to at least think about targeting mainland installations, especially Chinese radar installations, and maybe Chinese missile capabilities. These missiles would be sort of central to how China would go about fighting such a war. The problem, or one problem in this, is that the same organization that controls Chinese conventional missile capabilities also controls the nuclear capabilities, the Second Artillery Force. So could it be that in the midst of a rapid American blinding attack against Chinese Second Artillery Forces, they would think that this is not simply to target their conventional ballistic missile capabilities, but maybe they would think this is intended to target their nuclear missile capabilities, or their power to use them. In this circumstance, even if the U.S. intentions really were just to keep this thing local and conventional, China might not know that. China actually might have rational reasons for believing that the U.S. is trying to take out its nuclear force. After all, put yourself in the position of a Chinese leader. What have you watched the United States do over the last several decades? Build a conventional doctrine meant to force its enemies into sclerosis, and build more accurate and lethal nuclear weapons that are designed to hit very quick and very hardened targets. If I was a Chinese official, I might not be convinced by U.S. promises that these weren't targets against the Chinese capability. I might rationally presume that they were. And instead of suffering not only an embarrassing loss of Taiwan or some other issue, I might lose control over my nuclear deterrent force. I might use that force before I lose it. So the potential there is for inadvertent escalation. Now, about 5 years ago when I wrote this argument the first time, I was really concerned about air-sea battle and the possibility for inadvertent escalation. I'm a little less concerned today. I'm a little less concerned for some reasons. One, because the American officers that I talk to are more aware of this danger than they appeared to be 4 or 5 years ago. The conversation about inadvertent escalation has percolated, and people are more aware of it than they were before. Second, it does increasingly look like American planners can discriminate among different launch brigades in the Second Artillery Force. those that are purposely designed for nuclear operations and those that are not. Now, there's still a chance that there would be misperception or a misunderstanding, but the intelligence picture feels better. Both sides, it feels better for the United States. Finally, China has taken steps to improve its own communications. Right? China is starting, it appears to be slowly starting, but it seems to be training in more realistic conditions. It seems to be adding in contingencies in its training such that, say, for instance, if we lost some communications capability, could we still fight effectively? So the process of better U.S. intelligence and a more professional Chinese force, I think probably dampens the likelihood of inadvertent escalation. And some people say, very, very good analysts say, the chances of nuclear escalation are very, very small for these reasons. The fear of this going nuclear is actually quite small. Maybe they're right. Maybe both sides have gotten religion on this issue. Maybe U.S. planners and Chinese officials have spent enough time thinking through this problem and talking to each other about this problem that the chances of escalation have dampened. Indeed, one of the things that came out of this week's meeting was a new annex to a previous U.S.-China communique saying that we would talk more about crisis communications. If there is a problem, we will speak to each other about it. So both sides appear to be thinking this through and taking steps to dampen the risk of escalation. Is that good news? Of course it's good news. Nobody wants a nuclear war. That would be terrible. On the other hand, there might be an unexpected consequence of this. Because even if you solve the problem of nuclear escalation, or you make it highly unlikely, you don't solve the underlying political issues which would lead to conflict. And if a conflict occurs, in which both sides are confident that it's not going to escalate to the nuclear level, another thing could happen. Protracted war. It might be where both the United States and China believe that they can keep this at the convention. And it might be that both of them feel that they can execute their plans, both of which call for rapid offensives, dominance of the information space, and seizing and holding the initiative. They both might be wrong. History is riddled with great powers which go into war with each other with plans for rapid victory, and those plans do not pan out. The war is characterized by unexpected events, contingencies, things break. Units don't move as you expect them to move. The unexpected happens. Now, the United States has had success, as I mentioned earlier, against some enemies, but those were much smaller and less capable enemies. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. These are simply not the same category of rival as China did. So both China and the United States, despite all of their investment and all of their emphasis on winning rapidly, keeping things localized, not letting it spin out of control, they both might fail. If they failed in the early days of the war to achieve their plans, they're going to be in a tough spot. Because presumably the political stakes would be very high for them to take the risk of fighting in the first place. And then what are they left? A situation in which your war plans have failed, you're not willing to escalate, and yet the political stakes remain very high. This feels like a recipe for a protracted conflict with no easy way out. Now, there is a political science literature on protracted war, on why wars go on longer than anybody expects them to go. Mostly this literature is about civil wars for understandable reasons, but there is some emerging new literature which does help us understand it. And I've sort of put this literature into three buckets. One literature treats war as a bargaining process, and war ends when both sides realize that the value of the political object is not worth the cost of continuing to fight. It's a way of summarizing the literature. A second cause is politics and nationalism. When issues are of intrinsic national value, they're just really, really important, it's just hard to give up. It's hard to give up. Or if a ruling regime has staked itself to this issue and it feels like it will either be voted out of power or kicked out of power, it's unwilling to give up either. Until that regime is changed somehow, the war will persist. Finally, geography. whenever two sides have a durable refuge that they can retreat to if they need to, then the war is going to go on because neither can attack the other's center of gravity. Neither can really compel the other by causing enough pain to force it to back down. In this case, in the China-US case, the geography is pretty clear. The United States for a long time has been dominant on water, and China's been dominant on land. So in the scenario that I lay out, it's not hard to imagine that both sides could retreat to a durable refuge rather than having to give up. There is a precedent for this kind of war, the Peloponnesian War, the great and horrible conflict between Sparta and Athens, 5th century BC. Now, a lot of people talk about the Peloponnesian War in the China context as a potential flashpoint for the fighting. There's been some discussion of this. People like to talk about Thucydides and ask the question, why does war happen? I think Thucydides is more interesting in his discussion of the war after it begins. There's just a lot more there in the book. And a funny thing happens in this war. Both Sparta and Athens start with plans for winning quickly. Athens, the great sea power, believes that it can win quickly without having to fight Sparta on land. Sparta, after all, had a famous fighting formation called the phalanx. Sparta was this dominant land power in the ancient Greek world, really good at fighting on land. But Sparta was really lousy at fighting on the water. And Athens was the reverse. Athens was the dominant maritime power. It was terrific at naval warfare, and it couldn't fight its way out of a paper bag on the water. And yet, despite the fact that there was this really stark asymmetry in the war, both sides convinced themselves, they're really quite delusional about this, that they could fight and win against the other without having to hit its center of gravity. Athens contrived this convoluted plan to defeat Sparta by these little sort of coastal pinprick raids. Sparta contrived a plan to essentially rent a navy from Persia. It had this idea that it would just go out and get 500 warships from Persia. That would resolve this problem. It didn't know how to row them. It didn't know how to operate them. Never mind. Both of them, as the war approached and as the war seemed inevitable, they thought that they had found a way out of their big operational problem. Well, the first couple of years of war were a disaster for both of them. The first couple of years of the war disabused each side of its illusions. Sparta fought one big naval battle and was humiliated. And thereafter, any time it was on the water and it heard any indications that Athenian rowers were nearby, it turned tail and rowed away. The same thing happened to Athens on land. It sent out one big expedition, about 10,000 or so hoplites, and at the first sound that there were Spartans nearby, it turned tail and ran home. And this happened for years and years and years. And what developed was this terrible, protracted stalemate. Ultimately, the war goes on for 27 years. It's incredibly costly. It bankrupts both sides. Sparta wins the war in narrow terms. It wins in 404. It demolishes Athens' defensive walls. It occupies the city. Athens pretty much goes away. But it's a very short-lived victory for Sparta, which gets caught up in other regional politics and is quickly overrun itself. Both sides lose. It's a terrible, protracted war. Could such a thing happen in a U.S.-China conflict? I would hope that would be terrible, but I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility to think of. The United States and China both have very similar-looking ways that they think they can fight their opponent and win quickly, but both have a durable refuge, much as Sparta and Athens did. And after bad news in the first volley, they retreat without giving up. Could that happen in this case? I think that's the value of thinking about Thucydides and the U.S.-China conflict. So I'll end with some parting questions. As I said, that this is not a satisfying way to end a talk. I wish I had answers to all these questions. I don't. I'll give you some thoughts. Maybe you'll have better answers. Right? First, well, what is more likely? If things go badly, if the war doesn't go the way that either side plans it to go, what's more likely, escalation or protraction? It's hard to answer this question analytically because it turns out that some of the same factors that would make escalation possible also make protraction possible, like the fact of intense nationalism wrapped up in the Middle East. So it's very hard. I think there are some ways of actually answering this, though. The first has to do with, well, what happens in the first couple of days, really, of the fighting. Does it look like the United States is going to win quickly? Is it actually executing this plan as it wants to happen? Or not? And that's a simple, basic answer, but that might tell you something. If the U.S. is reasonably confident about its intelligence and about its targeting, that it can do this quickly and win quickly, then look out. You might want to ask some other questions, though. How confident is China that it can fight the United States? If China is confident that it can win quickly in a local war, then it might be willing to take risks that it otherwise would not take. It might be willing to take risks in the war. Similarly, is China confident that it can withstand a U.S. threat? Is China confident enough in the growth of its nuclear forces and the professionalization of its force that it can say, we're not risking everything if we're struck. We can absorb some mainland strikes. Well, if Chinese planners believe that, then the chances of protraction are much stronger. Second question, is it possible to prevent escalation without preventing protraction? Or are these things working at cross purposes? I think they are working at cross purposes. I think the things the United States could do to reduce the chance of protraction actually make a long war more possible. What do you do to make escalation unlikely? You don't target the mainland. Not all. You make it very clear to Chinese leaders that that is a threshold you're not willing to walk over. And you send the signal that the worst possible outcome is any nuclear exchange. Well, that would be a great way of dampening all those escalatory pressures I mentioned earlier. But if Chinese leaders believe these signals, and they understand that this is the U.S. threshold, well, then they can hunker down and prepare to fight a war. Indeed, the U.S. would be deliberately inhibiting itself. It would be deliberately saying, we're not going to hit your center of gravity. We're not going to deny you this refuge. We're not going to threaten your deterrent force. So China would have a lot less to lose by simply fighting a protracted, if lower, conflict. I don't know that there's a way to resolve this tension. And trying to solve one problem might make it worse. Finally, what will it require to end a protracted war? If U.S. leaders decide that the risks of protraction is a better outcome than escalation, which is, I don't think, unreasonable, U.S. leaders ought to think about how to end this. How to avoid the terrible Peloponnesian scenario in which the thing goes on interminably, doing terrible damage, not just military damage, not just cost in terms of lives and hardware, but damage to the global economy. How do you make this kind of fight stop? Well, one thing to do is U.S. leaders will have to come to grips with the CCP. That is, put aside any notion that regime change is the sine qua non for ending the war. Sort of as we've found with Syria, demanding regime change is not a good way to stop fighting. It convinces the adversary regime to dig in. The United States might be wise to avoid such rhetoric, even in the event of a conflict, even if hostilities were advanced. Put aside the notion of regime change. Learn to accept that the CCP will be the government even after the fight starts. And more profoundly, U.S. leaders will have to think about accepting something less than victory. That getting out of this kind of conflict in a way that doesn't bankrupt the United States or really do quite serious damage to the U.S. and the global economy will mean accepting a limited, emotionally unsatisfying outcome. This might be hard to convince. It might be hard to convince American leaders to do this, to accept a truce or limited gains or some halfway solution on this that gives your adversary, the CCP, an offer, a way to stay in power. But I would suggest that getting ready for something less than total victory might be the only way to preserve U.S. interest, preserve the regional status quo without suffering either of these terrible scenarios. I will stop there. And I'm happy to fill
very much judged. Whether one agrees with you or not, one certainly cannot criticize you for being obscure. This was the most lucid presentation on a fairly complex subject, laid out with extraordinary clarity. I'll let you field questions unless you want me to.
No, I can. You spoke a little bit earlier about not getting Chinese mainland and also sort of limiting on war. When you speak of conventional, non-conventional, where does cyber fit into this? Could you conceivably imagine us trying to do this sort of air-sea battle concept without attacking command and control of the mainland?
Yeah, I think that cyber would absolutely be part of this. I mean, I don't know this. There's no classified information. It's just hard to see the United States trying to wage this kind of counter communications attack, for lack of a better word, without doing it in the cyber domain. The U.S. has invested heavily in offensive cyber operations. Seems to be quite good at it. Right? Given that the nature of communications has changed, I think that would be a part of it. Now, the problem, at least some Air Force officers think about this a lot. They think that cyber is tied up with nuclear. That if you start hitting cyber, you're getting into something that could quickly escalate to nuclear because of the way that networks are linked together. I'm not quite that nervous about it. I see cyber as just a modern form of communications. I don't see cyber as the scale of cyber is different, but it's just another way of communicating. So I don't think that Chinese officials would necessarily see cyber attack as equivalent to nuclear attack. It would be hardwired into a conventional operation. I think either side would be about cyber attacks. Wouldn't necessarily be
It's current right now, but the boots on the ground, or the boots on the keyboard scenario, is there are, enormously multiplication or exponentially more people in China who speak English, who can hack English computers, versus Americans working for the military who can hack Chinese. I mean, isn't that true?
I don't know the total numbers. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of debates about how many people are involved in the Chinese side versus how many people are involved on the American side. If you listen to Chinese commentators on this, they say we suffer more cyber attacks than anybody in the world. So clearly there are people out there, this is over against Chinese society with arm. So clearly there are people capable of targeting China in offensive cyber operations. If you listen to Americans and listen to the administration, the Chinese PLA is very active in coordinating attacks on not only U.S. military installations and government agencies, but the private sector as well. I don't know where the balance lies. I mean, my read on the sort of balance of cyber capabilities, the United States is pretty good at this. The United States has pulled off sort of the most noteworthy offensive cyber operations, specifically Stuxnet, that others haven't. So I don't know that it's lopsided in favor of China, but frankly, I don't know.
Yes, you talked a lot about nationalism on the Chinese side and how that can trigger sort of calls for the CCP to respond in ways that they may or may not want to respond. I guess my question for you is nationalism on the American side. Let's say we have a situation where a carrier battle group is in the vicinity of Taiwan or Yalu, wherever it may be, and either by accident or on purpose, there is an escalation occurs, and the Dongfang 2021C actually does what it's supposed to do and knocks out either a carrier or damages an American warship to an extent that is difficult to keep it on CNN. I don't see an American public willing to sit there and say, well, that's okay, we don't want to risk a nuclear war. I guess, and in many ways, could you argue that in a democratic state like the United States, there may actually be more pressure on the leadership to some form of retaliation than you might have in a more authoritarian state like China? I'd just like to hear your thoughts on it.
It's a great point. And China certainly has no monopoly on nationalism. Right? U.S. nationalism is strong in here, so it's strong basically everywhere. I see nationalism affecting the U.S. in at least two ways in these scenarios. One, I totally agree. If China was able to get a carrier shot in and either sink it or kill a lot of American sailors, a big fiery mess on TV, that would arouse a lot of passions in the United States. A lot of flag-waving nationalism, a huge desire for retaliation and revenge for all. I suspect that American naval leaders know this and political leaders. And so the dilemma for, or at least one of the dilemmas involved in this conflict, is whether or not the United States would want to target China's on-land radar installation. So in order to make this ballistic missile work, it really would rely on what's called over-the-horizon radar. These are enormous radar complexes. I mean, huge, up to a kilometer, I think up to a kilometer long, right, in order to cover that much water. Very soft targets. Right? The United States could easily target these radars, but they're on the mainland. They're actually relatively deep because of this concern about not wanting to lose a carrier and not wanting to see a lot of American sailors die or see that damage, especially on TV, the U.S. might have this terrible dilemma. Do we take the risk of sailing in theater, take the risk of that happening, or do we take the opposite risk of targeting these radar complexes on TV? Nationalism might compel a mainland strike, which could lead to a lot of escalatory pressures back on China. The other way that nationalism, I think, could affect the U.S. is my very last point. Okay? The notion of accepting a limited victory against China, a notion of saying, okay, all is forgiven, CCP, you remain in power, I think would be really difficult for a lot of Americans to accept. When there is war, there's a lot of name-calling. People, in the heat of war, people characterize their opponent in the worst possible terms. I imagine that if a war occurred between the U.S. and China, we would hear a lot about the tyrannical communist one-party dictatorship. And if we got to the point where it came down to accepting a limited victory, providing an off-ramp for that one-party system, Americans would say, hey, wait a minute. You've been telling us for a while that these guys are just the worst, and now you're going to let them stay in power? And we're not actually going to defeat them? We're going to let this thing fester with them in power? It might be hard to convince some U.S. leaders to accept that. It might be hard to convince the American people who are sort of whipped up in nationalist frenzy to accept that. And there's history here as well. For this, I look as a cautionary tale to Iraq in the 1990s. Right? After the first Gulf War, the United States easily defeats the Iraqi military. But by any measure, Iraq is no longer a threat to anybody in the region. Its conventional military is shattered, its economy is in tatters, it doesn't have any WMD. Iraq is just removed as a threat. And the situation for Iraq gets worse and worse through the 90s. It gets weaker and weaker and weaker through the 1990s. But American officials don't like it. They don't like the fact that that man, Saddam, is still in Baghdad. They don't like the fact that we have to tolerate this odious regime. And believe Saddam Hussein's one odious guy. It's terrible. The Americans said, we've got this extraordinary military. Why do we have to deal with this? We don't want a limited victory. We want a complete victory. We want him out. And so they went and they got him out. And it satisfied, at least for a while, that itch. We went in, we took care of it in what seemed like a more conclusive, decisive way. We didn't like having an incomplete half victory. Hegemons don't like half victories, they like the big victory. What I'm suggesting is to get out of this kind of conflict, American leaders might have to start getting ready for a half victory. Getting ready for figuring out how to control their own impulses to do more.
Sir, the question of two parts, but I'm curious about your predictions, if any, about Chinese reaction to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as well, not having China included thus far, as well as last week's legislation in Japan about the military being able to oversee that.
I don't have strong predictions about the TPP and the Chinese response. incidentally, we at SMU, we just hosted one of the U.S. negotiators of the TPP, and we put that question to him. And his answer was, Chinese rhetoric is a little overheated. If China wants to join, they can join when they're ready. My own instinct is that China looks at the TPP as a possible part of a broader threat program of concern. Even if that's the wrong way to think about it, Chinese leaders might be concerned. But I don't know how much the concern over that part of U.S.-China politics will take. I think they'd be more concerned over the Japan scenario. Because there has been escalating hostilities and even almost military crises between these two countries. It's been rising for the last several years. So in terms of something that would lead to the kind of conflict I'm talking about, that would be much more concern.
So kind of going along with the Japan factor, what do you think the role and kind of given the limited capabilities of the U.S. allies, but also their proximity to China, so like South Korea, Japan, and then even other regional actors like Vietnam and Indonesia, Philippines, how do you think they would kind of impact all of this?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer offhand. I know that both sides are at least speaking about keeping this contained region. In Chinese military writings, they repeatedly talk about keeping this localized. They don't want it to escalate horizontally. I think the Americans want the same thing. You can imagine scenarios in which it does happen. That if the United States and China are occupying themselves, that somebody on the Korean Peninsula might sense an opportunity. I don't know that that would necessarily happen. I actually think South Korea is pretty formidable all by itself. So I don't know that that would happen, but great power wars are hard to contain. They're different. They do tend to have these ripple effects. So it's something to watch.
Sir, you had said coming from like the radar installations and us bombing them as a soft target. And coming from an Air Force standpoint of everything, where cyberspace is becoming more and more like the forefront of warfare in the modern age. Do you see like a cyber attack on one of these radar installations maybe equivalent of bombing a soft target as far as escalation and response into that?
Yeah, it's a great question. My sense is no.
Okay.
Right? My sense is no for a couple of reasons. One, there's nothing explodes. You don't have that shock effect of something exploding, right? If you go home and your TV doesn't work, right, you're maybe a little miffed, but you're not shocked. Well, I can fix this. I can put it together. It might take some time, but I can make this work. If you go home and you're sitting around, all of a sudden your tube just explodes, that would be shocking. Right? You might respond in weird ways. I think that the other part of it is that if you are the target of a cyber attack, you can easily, well not so easily, but you can recover. You don't have to rebuild components. Right? You might have to swap out software, you might have to swap out hardware, but you don't have to rebuild the thing. So my guess is that you could recover more quickly from a cyber attack than you could from a kinetic attack, especially on an installation like a radar this size. It just improves. So my sense is that China might not like it, and it might prove to be escalatory, but not as escalatory as it could have.
Actually, that was a question that sort of anticipated what I was going to ask. One of the things that we fretted about a great deal during the Cold War, for those of us who actually lived through it, was the danger of electromagnetic pulse and knocking out all manner of communications. As you were talking, I was actually thinking that we might, but you seem to sort of fend it off already by your answer to the previous question. I was thinking instead of EMP being a problem, now with the Air Force and with Cyber Command increasingly investing in offensive capabilities, and this flies in the face of Thomas Ridd's book, Cyber War Will Not Happen. I was thinking that why would we be inhibited if we wanted to blind the capabilities of an adversary like the Chinese, that even before we undertake kinetic operations, we use our cyber capabilities to largely defang them, in terms of their radar, communications, CQ-type.
Yeah, I think, well, two.
Am I getting my
Yeah, two
point
ways of
across?
answers, because I don't think I've been clear. I actually agree with Thomas Britt in his book, at least the crux of his argument.
Yes.
When he says cyber war will take place, he's fighting against an argument that the entire war will be waged in the cyber domain.
Right.
That this is a conflict of ones and zeros. And he's saying, well, that's not really war, and that to the extent cyber is going to take place, it's going to assist conventional forces. It's going to be part. So I agree with him, and I agree with you as well. I do think that cyber attacks would be likely to be part of a blinding campaign. The United States doesn't really want an enemy that can shoot back,
Right.
at least not quickly, for understandable reasons. So I think that a cyber attack would take place, but I think that it would be connected with conventional operations and as a prelude to a much bigger conventional surge.
And the reason I brought EMP up is one of the things we fretted about is with EMP, you could have a problem of war termination. Because the guys say, okay, we've had enough. We really don't want any more escalation. But I can't communicate to various people and say, hey, you guys, don't fire those missiles. We've given up. We're crying uncle. And now with cyber war, we may have crippled certain nodes, which now prevent the enemy from saying, no, please, mercy.
And I think this is an important trade-off. And I think that if you look at American policy statements versus its sort of operational planning, it might be working at cross purposes. Because the United States is increasingly, with specific reference to China, talking about improving communications, even in a crisis, wanting to keep lines open so that the worst doesn't happen. And at the same time, we're clearly investing in the kind of technologies which would inhibit the other side's communications and break connections between them. This is something that another reason among many why military planners and political leaders need to get together as they're thinking about these sort of terrible scenarios.
Sort of a related question there to this. I think they used to call that decapitation attacks on the systems. What is the decision process that the Chinese military is going to be going through? Who has control over these weapons, and is any of that delegated to lower levels of the possibility of stakes?
So nuclear weapons, the nuclear weapons, as I understand it, are under tight control. Right? There are parts of the PLA which have more flexibility, but nuclear weapons, for obvious reasons, are under tight control. That said, one analyst has pointed out that if you read the Science of Second Artillery campaigns, there's a section in it which almost suggests that delegation might happen in extreme conditions. There's this one little sort of frightening passage in which they say if communications were really, really broken, field commanders would have some discretion to act as long as they understood their higher guidance before communications were severed. That's the others in this room might know better than me, but that's the only sort of point in Chinese nuclear command and control that there's that sort of wiggle room. Usually they talk about it being very tightly controlled. Of course.
Thanks. I applaud you for tackling these questions, which are both extremely difficult to answer and also very difficult. So I'm with you there. You've certainly given the audience a lot to think about. I have a lot of comments, but I'll limit myself to three, all of which will be masquerading as questions and asked in increasing degree of scope. The first, this is...
I'm going to get a pen.
Yeah, get it.
The first, as you may have noticed during the earlier part of your talk, I had a little bit of a reaction when you said that there's a Japanese police garrison permanently stationed on Senkaku Island. This is the first I've ever heard of that, and I was wondering if you could share your source.
No, it's a Japanese colleague of mine, because I was having an argument with him, and I said these are meaningless. There's no garrison there. He alerted me to the Japanese use of a small base, which he then took alert for me, and to me it looked like nothing. Right? To me it was sort of insignificant, but he says that they do some transit there. My point was that
if you could share that Google Maps link.
Sure.
This is
But the point is, it's not relevant. It's not strategically.
My point would be that it would be relevant if there wasn't, let's say that. On air-sea battle, it's been a while since they looked specifically at the air-sea battle concept, so I'll defer to you as to the current status of it within the Pentagon. But I'm curious concerning the extent to which your overall argument rests on the idea that ASB constitutes U.S. official doctrine. Last I heard, it's a concept that's being discussed and is highly controversial both among civilians and within the Pentagon. But in your talk, you seem to present it as though it is this decided U.S. doctrine. And I was just wondering what you're basing that on.
Okay, did you have a third?
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to, it was kind of already touched on, but building off the earlier question about U.S. allies, your focus, for understandable reasons, is almost entirely on the U.S. and China. But as you know, a likely conflict is not going to occur in a vacuum if for no other reason than the U.S. hub and spoke alliance system, and in particular U.S. bases in Japan. You mentioned the second artillery in China's ballistic missiles. Yes, everyone talks about ASBM, anti-ship ballistic missile, potentially a second one, more capable one that was created out of Beijing this month. But arguably, we have countermeasures for that. It's a threat, it's a major concern, but there are some countermeasures for that. What we haven't really dealt with yet is the issue that we rely so heavily on forward deployed military forces permanently stationed in Japan and air bases in particular. Those runways are extremely vulnerable. So if I'm a Chinese defense planner, if I'm the Chinese leader and I'm serious about actually using kinetic military force against the U.S., that's my first target. And one of the most remarkable developments that you referred to in the last 20 years is the second artillery and its focus on conventionally tipped ballistic missiles. And those bases are very vulnerable. So I don't know how in this, I'm not sure if this is a war game or what exactly you're doing here, but I don't know how you can leave U.S. allies out.
Yeah, well, I mean, first, this is not meant to be exhaustive. This is not meant to be a consideration of every possibility in a U.S.-China conflict. I'm highlighting the two worst scenarios. Okay? And I'm deliberately stylizing these scenarios that we can talk about escalation and contraction, because this seems to be the antithesis of what the U.S. wants and what it's used to fight in conventional war. Short, quick, conventional, decisive victories. Right? These are the two big ways we can want. You're absolutely right. This doesn't cover every ally. This doesn't cover every scenario. I also agree entirely with your comment on bases at risk. And there's been great work on just how at risk they are. I commend the RAND study that came out either last week or the week before, which goes into grisly detail about how relatively easy it would be to crater runways at air bases. This is not as hard. Now, there are things the U.S. could do there as well, but that would probably prevent preemptive action. Okay? So this is another problem. In terms of the comment of is air-sea battle really an American dominance? I get this a lot. And here's the backstory. Here's why I come at this. When people like me have made this argument, well, I've gotten pushback from official circles, which is, well, this is not necessarily official doctrine, right? The most elaborate presentation of air-sea battle actually came from a think tank.
Right.
CSBA wrote this long monograph on air-sea battle. The thing is, when you read what Air Force and Navy leaders actually wrote about air-sea battle, it basically mimics what CSBA was talking about. At least conceptually, it's no different. Right? And I've pushed them on this fact. It's basically no different. Now, they don't get into the level of granularity that the CSBA report does, but their conceptual understanding of the fight is the same. Right? It's a two-step, and the first step involves controlling information, right? And potentially even involving deep strikes, and the second step is a surge of forces. So, American military leaders have moved away from air-sea battle because the name is radioactive now. So they've come up with this completely forgettable acronym, JAMGC, Joint Concept for Access, Maneuver, in the Global Commons, JAMGC. I still call it air-sea battle because, as far as I can tell, the concept hasn't changed. Right? they've tried to walk back the cat on it. The other thing I'll say about why I think that this may not be to the letter exactly how the U.S. is going to fight a China war, this is the pattern, the basic pattern of U.S. conventional operations in its last several conventional conflicts. So why that would suddenly change is a mystery.
Those conflicts have been against extremely inferior adversaries. It's easy,
Well,
it's relatively easy to blind them. So you can imagine why they might come up with a different doctrine. Again, I think we're talking past each other, concept versus doctrine, as opposed to whether the substance of the concept differs from the seized view.
I don't know.
But
In a way, that's a no. But one last point on this is that these ideas didn't come out of thin air. So for a long time before I went to SMU, I was a professor at the Naval War College, right? So I was a Navy employee, and with a lot of conversations with a lot of officers, I kept hearing the same things over and over again. Right? Even in a contest with China, the same impulse to blind, the same impulse to preserve your own forces by denying your enemies the opportunity to hit you first, convinced me that at least what's out in the public sphere has the whiff of official thinking on this problem, even if it's not.
One tiny question, which is, I'm wondering if you could do your best to characterize what the known unknowns are. So I'm thinking things like DARPA or other areas that essentially we have limited capacity to understand what could change, particularly whether it's a doctor or technological capacity. I know it's sort of an unfair question, but you painted a very sort of helpful framework for thinking down a couple of pathways. And I'm wondering if you can tell us maybe not what the other pathways necessarily are, but what the space around those pathways looks like, right? So sort of what your unknowns, what you know about it, what you don't know.
That's a fabulous question. I think that there's two big known unknowns. Okay? They're not so much technical as they are political. And the first one has to do with thresholds. Do we really know what China's threshold would be for escalation? There seems to be a lot of increasing amounts of ambiguity in its doctrine. For a long time it really was no first use, pretty straightforward. Now there are a bunch of scenarios in which maybe they would feel more inclined to go to the nuclear level. But would they really? Right? What would it really take for them to go nuclear? That's a no. The other big one has to do with confidence. How confident is China really that it could fight this kind of war against the United States? It spent 20 years building the capabilities. It spent 20 years professionalizing the force. But when the chips are down, will it really be willing to risk this kind of engagement? The United States has still got important qualitative advantages and will for a long time. Right? How much confidence does China have really? Right? Was its military parade, was it a show of confidence or was it bluster? I don't know that. I don't think you really can know that. Right? And you certainly can't know what confidence level China will have 10, 15, 20 years from now. So I think, again, those would be my two big known unknowns, the threshold question and the confidence question.
If there are no further questions, we bring this to a formal close. Thanks very much once again, Josh, for coming and for a marvelous talk and an extraordinary discussion.